with an 8-inch mag draft. Backlash casting into the wind.
Hey, welcome back. The wind is we fishermen's friend and enemy. Now, under a lot of windy conditions, fish are active and easy to catch on those moving baits. This makes casting our lure into the wind very necessary sometimes, and especially when fish choose to position themselves to face the wind. But casting into wind could be a messy situation, as you all know. The wind will cost a lot of casting distance, and for a bait casting reel like this, you can also expect a lot more likelihood to get a backlash.
How to cast into the wind with confidence. This is what we're going to talk about in this video.
Now, in our last video, we talked about the dark force, aka the air drag or air resistance. Now, from the equation, we know the reason why it is so hard to cast directly into the wind is because the wind is increasing the relative velocity v. Now, because air drag is proportional to the square of the relative velocity, so if your lure flies at 20 miles per hour in windless condition, then all of a sudden you get a head-on gust at 20 miles per hour as well. Now the v doubles. The air drag actually then quadruples. Now when this drastically increases the air drag impacts your lure, it causes the lure to decelerate or lose its speed very quickly, which in turn leads to shorter casting distance and or backlash. So in order to fight the difficulty of casting to wind, what we're really looking at is to alleviate this deceleration caused by wind resistance.
Now, based on Newton's second law of motion, we know the deceleration of a lure can be calculated by dividing the air drag force over the weight of the lure. Now, we also know the air drag Fd can be calculated using the equation on the bottom from our last video. Now, if we combine these two equations, we get this. Don't worry, we're not going to do any actual calculations. And also, please feel free to jump to the conclusion for tips and tricks using the time points.
So, knowing that our mission is to reduce the deceleration A, with the help of this equation, we can now conveniently look for what we can do to make A smaller. Now look at the dark force equation. The density of air is very hard to change unless you are Godzilla. Now let's move on. If we can decrease the product of drag coefficient CD and the cross-sectional area A while maintaining everything else the same, then we can make the A smaller, right? So what does it mean by decreasing the product of CD times A? Now this means switching to a lure with same weight but more aerodynamic design or has a smaller cross-sectional area. Now for instance, switching from a spinnerbait to a slender jerkbait, or switch to a metal blade, or simply using a smaller profile bait, these are all going to help. And I'm sure a lot of us have already implemented similar tactics. And then there is this M, or the lure weight. Now if everything else stays the same or changes very little, by increasing the weight of the lure or rig, we can also decrease the deceleration caused by air drag. Just using heavier lure will not always make it easier to cast into wind because the cross-sectional area will usually get bigger as well. However, if we use lure of higher density with the same shape and cross-sectional area, then we will be able to increase the weight only. Now, in other words, just switch your lead weight to tungsten won't make it cast easier into the wind, or using the bait that has tungsten weight transfer balls will also have the same effect. Now, all that we just talked about are certainly effective ways to make the cast easier into the wind. However, a lot of times, the choice of lure is dictated by fish's appetite that day under those windy conditions, not necessarily by what flies easier and far into the wind. Well, for instance, a spinnerbait is often a heck of a productive lure under windy conditions. Fish loves it, but it is among the lures having the highest amount of air drag, and it could be very challenging to cast into the wind directly. Now, what if the fish would not bite jerkbait or spybait, or wouldn't even look at a spinnerbait of a smaller profile? And the only thing they want is a big old profile spinnerbait. Now, what do? Now, we all know the spinnerbait tends to spin during the cast. And whenever that happens, you lose distance and usually end up with a backlash. Now, what really happens when the spinnerbait spins in the flight is the product of air drag coefficient and the cross-sectional area increases significantly when it spins, now leading to a much higher deceleration caused by the increased air drag. If we can stop the mid-air spin and keep the spinnerbait flying steady in this position, this way, it will be really helpful, right? So to this end, for spinnerbaits, we can buy hidden weight spinnerbaits. Now they have half of the head weight moved back onto the hook shank, now giving the bait a lot more stability during cast. It really spins mid-air and making the cast much easier into the wind, even if you stay with a bigger profile. Now for plug type of baits, like the jerkbait or the crankbait, a good weight transfer system will stabilize the bait in the flight and literally make it go a long way in the wind. And typical big tungsten ball systems work very nicely, but also like the LBO systems developed by Megabus is on another level. It cuts through wind like nothing else. The bait never flips during flight, and all these really helps to cast into the wind.
Every season starts from Megabus. This is the Megabus LBO. Well, today's actual windless. I don't really need the LBO system to help in the cast, but I need this bait to go really shallow to trigger those reaction bites. But anyway, this is my first bass of the season 2025. Every season starts from Megabass.
And then last but not least, looking at the equation, we could really do a lot about the relative speed because it has the biggest impact on the deceleration. Now, a very interesting feature of the air drag equation is basically saying the higher the speed of the lure, the higher the air drag it will feel. So this also means the air drag itself is also a changing force as the speed of the lure changes during the entire process of casting. So usually it's decelerating. So the air resistance becomes smaller and smaller and smaller as the velocity of the lure drops. So what we can do first is actually casting less forcefully. So the wind speed picked up, but we can still drop the lure speed to overall control the relative speed. And this way, the deceleration of the lure caused by the air drag, which was in turn caused by the increase of the square of the velocity, won't be too high. Now, it will be easier to control and avoid backlash. So this is talking more from a perspective of avoiding backlash. However, this does result in sacrifice of casting distance. Now, is there really no way of minimizing the distance loss while avoiding backlash casting into the wind? Don't worry, let's find out together.
May the force be with you.
So when wind acts on our lure in the opposite direction, it slows down our lure. And at the same time, our lure is also reacting on the wind. Now, it theoretically also slows down wind. Now, this is Newton's third law of motion. But there was no way we could feel the slowdown of wind caused by the lure because the lure is just too small. The magnitude of change is tiny. However, when wind acts on large objects or huge surface area, now the reaction from the large objects and the surface becomes obvious on the wind. That is because of the same air drag or friction or resistance. The reaction from the large objects will slow down the wind speed significantly. Now, when wind is blowing across the lake, the wind speed right above the water surface will be slowed down, and sometimes much slower than the wind speed that is 10 to 15 feet above the water surface. And this slowdown effect is not caused by trees or buildings, the water surface alone, even on a wide open water surface, will do it because of the air drag interaction with the water surface. Now think like this. We know when wind blows across the lakes, it creates waves and chops. Now waves and chops are essentially water being moved around. And water carries weight. So to move weight around, it costs energy. And this part of energy is basically being transferred from wind to water. Even if I blow my water in the cup, it does the same thing. Hence, the wind speed will be slower close to the water surface. Now, scientists measure the speed of wind above the surface, and the speed will actually form a gradient like that. As the elevation goes up, wind speed will pick up. Now, this part where wind speed is lower than the uninterfered speed on higher elevation now is called the boundary layer. Now, have you ever seen ducks actually flying very close to the water surface? Now, they are not trying to hide noodles from our dragon warrior for sure. What they are doing is mainly taking advantage of the so-called ground effect. But at the same time, in windy days, they do tend to fly low to stay in the low wind speed zone to save energy. So back to our problem, what can we learn from the ducks to make casting a big spinnerbait into the wind smoother? Now, if we can keep our spinnerbait flying close to the water surface to take the advantage of the boundary layer of the slower wind speed, which is lower the relative velocity v, then we can experience much less air drag from the wind. Thus, less backlash and a longer casting distance into the wind. Now, what could we do to keep the spinnerbait close to water? Avoid overhead cast. Now, overhead cast will put the bait somewhere like 10 to 15 feet above the water at least, and plus the line behind your lure will feel a lot of wind impact as well. Now, we should do casts having low lure trajectories to keep the lure fly low and feel less impact from the wind. I personally like the sidearm roll cast the best for these situations. It's easy to cast, you can still input a lot of force or power and still have good distance. Now, this is also easy to adjust the height of the lure to reach for longer distance. Now, I have been using this trick a long time and it really works. Now, if you combine the sidearm roll cast with the hidden weight spinnerbait like this, casting the spinnerbait directly into the strong head-on wind is no longer a problem. So up to here, we just dealt with the challenge of casting into the wind using the so-called dark force equation. Now, if you are still with me, and if you used to think math and physics are nerdy and not cool, I hope you might have a little bit different thought right now. The reason you might find it not cool is probably because it was not put into the context to solve real-world problems. Well, anyway, back to the topic. In fact, the dark force equation is carrying even more solutions and informations to a few other challenging casting scenarios, and for instance, casting light lures. Now, many times when we are casting with BFS tackle, even if we are casting small metal spoons with good aerodynamic design, if we use too much force, it is very easy to get a nasty backlash than with heavier lures on normal bass tackles. Why is that? Now, the answer is also in the equation. Now, light lure means the M is small. Now again, our mission is to keep this deceleration A small. Now, if you cast with too much force, which means the V is very high, the air drag is high. Now, if you are casting your normal weight bass lure, the deceleration can still be handled by your reel's main brake. However, now your lure weight M is much smaller, meaning the same amount of air drag will create an even higher deceleration. Now at this point, it just exceeds how much your reel brake could handle. Hence, much easier to get a nasty backlash if your thumb is not trained. That is one of the main reasons why when casting small lures on BFS tackle, the best way to do it in most cases is just to ease it out, not to force it. Then there is even more. Look.
And at the top is the deceleration of lure caused by air drag, and the bottom is the deceleration of spool caused by centrifugal brake.
In both equations, typically, the relative velocity v is the only variant. So what we can do is actually to combine all the constant values, like the air density, weight, and the friction coefficient, etc., all into a big old constant. And in each of those equations, for the lure deceleration, you get A lure equals C1 times the V square. For spool deceleration, you get AS equals C2 times V square. Now, do they look very similar? And what these tell us is the deceleration caused by air drag is proportional to the square of the lure velocity, while the spool deceleration caused by the centrifugal brake is also proportional to the square of the spool velocity. So these two are both responding to the square of the two velocities, and this is how centrifugal brake controls spool rotation at the same magnitude of the change imposed by the air drag on a flying lure. And under ideal conditions, the lure velocity and the spool velocity are somewhat similar or even the same. So this is how centrifugal brake works. And we just deciphered it. Now that you see how we can utilize the dark force equation to analyze casting scenarios in the real world, you can try using it yourself to decipher the factors required for other situations, such as casting accuracy and casting long distance. Please don't just take my words and conclusions for the face value today. Go try it yourself next time on the water, and you will be surprised. Now with that, tight lines, and I'll see you in the next one. And we will go back to the underwater footage for the next one, and it will be a good one. Now, I have been using this trick a long time, and it really works. Now, if you combine the sidearm roll cast with those hidden weight spinnerbait,